morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to our Chaos series. Another highly requested theory video, Chaos and Xenos. How do the various alien factions of 40k deal with and interact with the forces of chaos? Now, for chaos interactions, we are going to group them as followers. We're going to be going into the various levels and ways that individual Xenos factions within the universe can interact with chaos. Can they be turned to chaos? Can they aid chaos in some way? Can they help human chaos worshippers? Or can they turn to chaos and follow it on their own? There are three general forms of this. They have a lot of subforms, a lot of ways to kind of qualify them. There is the highest form, which is essentially the non-human race can become full worshippers in their own right with knowledge of the gods. Essentially, they can become a full-blown cultist, organize their own cults. No matter what level or difficulty they have to do in order to achieve that point, they can at least do it. Many races are totally incapable of genuinely becoming worshippers on the same level that humans are. It's very different. Some of them are so inherently unable or unwilling that they are completely not able to do it themselves. They would need to be forced to do it. Others are likely to do it, but not entirely able to do it on their own. And then some are completely able to do it, and all it would take is a little bit of change or assistance that can be beneficial to them. So you don't have to threaten them into it. They can do it willingly, which is kind of the point with Chaos Worship. You want it to be willing. You don't want it to be forced. There's a lot less benefit for the gods out of that. There's the medium form of chaos interaction where they can interact positively with chaos and possibly even sacrifice to the gods, but they can't interact the same way that humans do. Now, there are various ways of looking at this. I mean, some of these species can definitely help. They can work as mercenaries or work as assistants to chaos forces, but they're not necessarily capable of that last step. They can positively interact with chaos. They can positively contribute to the gods, but they can't interact with the warp in the same exact way that humans do. Now, there are several different ways of looking at this, but essentially they're not able to become full-blown cultists. They can work alongside a cult, they can work hand in hand with a cult, they can even theoretically become worshippers of the gods in name, but their worship by their very nature is limited to a certain level of below humanness. And then finally, the lowest form, which means that they can be tangentially useful to chaos forces, or at least not hinder them outright. So these are things where Xenos can cause an opportunity for chaos, or cause a negative event or reaction that leads to chaos being benefited, but they are not necessarily doing it consciously, and some of them are inherently resistant to chaos in such a way that they're actually negative, or just you want to stay out of their way, essentially. Chaos forces tend to stay out of the way of the lowest form of chaos interaction because they can't get much benefit directly from that Xenos species. The first one that we have up is the Eldar. And for conversion, how do you convert the Eldar? Well, there are some big problems with converting true Eldari to the worship of chaos. The first one is that, like all of the Eldar, Dark and normal Eldari, there's a strong taboo against chaos worship in their society because their souls are claimed by Slaanesh. Now, the Eldar protect them with the Soul Stones to, keep themselves from being devoured, but that taboo still stands. Even if it wasn't for the fact that they were constantly under threat from the gods, they would still dislike chaos because it's part of their society that is a bad thing. And then, of course, there is the secondary part. The Eldar are highly psychic. They are highly aware of chaos. They are hyper-vigilant for chaos corruption, and they tend to be quite resilient to corruption in general. And this, as a whole, this combination of psychological, physical taboo and physical restriction, their bodies being psychic, their minds being locked and trained against chaos, well, it makes true conversion, aka talking an Eldar into becoming a cultist, or convincing an Eldar to turn to the way of the gods, or even to help you, as someone who is a worshipper of the gods, is very difficult and sometimes dangerous, because the Eldar are fairly well known for just attacking Chaos worshippers off the rip and not really letting you get a word in edgewise. Capture an Eldar, there's a solid chance they might try and kill themselves before you can actually try to convert them the traditional way. There is one caveat to this, and it's proof that the Eldar can be corrupted. Now, it is a forced corruption. It's not like a nice, easy conversion like you can get with humans, where you can willingly get them to go along with the cult or religion that you're making up. No, corrupting the Eldar is a far more direct measure. Essentially, you have to use either psychic powers to psychically dominate them, not impossible, but a little bit more difficult depending on the Eldar, or you can always possess them. So, physically forcing corruption, which is something that I've talked about before, and I'll talk about in future corruption and mutant videos, you can physically force corruption onto a living being. It's just difficult and usually a bit dangerous because it tends to have some negative side effects on them, including madness, unrestrained mutation, and sometimes death. Just on occasion, they do just die. So it can be done, they can be converted, it's just either incredibly difficult or dangerous in the traditional sense, or less useful than standard conversion in the corruption sense. So you can force it, but they're a lot less useful, and they aren't really true worshippers if they're just a chaos spawn or a possessed. How then can they be helpful to chaos forces? Well, they often hold chaos relics or chaotic relics, psychically active weapons, items from their long historical past, things of that nature that you won't really get your hands on the Imperium in the Imperium all that easily. Now, some of these are not actually chaos relics, they are just relics that can be turned to the use of chaos. For example, relics of the original gods, ancient pieces of Eldar technology, all of these can theoretically be of value to a warp-worshipping chaos cult. And the other part is valuable items apart from that. Equipment, materials. Wraithbone, to a degree, can actually be pretty useful to Chaos Cultists, depending on how you use it. And of course, the most important and valuable thing about the Eldar is their souls. For a Slaaneshi cult, and we'll get to this in a minute, the soul of the Eldar is actually the primary valuable thing that the Eldar possesses. And in order to remove that soul, you often have to kill the Eldar. So it is technically a valuable item that they are holding onto, but it makes converting a dead body a lot harder than if they were still in possession of such a valuable item. How then can their material or equipment be used? Well, there are some issues with Wraithbone. Eldar Tech is great. Eldar Tech is very powerful, Eldar Tech is very capable, and it is of the correct size a majority of the time to be utilized by humans. I mean, a little bit of modification here and there, it's not impossible. The stuff is tough and psychically active, so it could theoretically be corrupted or worked in that way. Again, that's just your prerogative how you want to influence Wraithbone, but the big problem is the Wraithbone dying, it becoming less workable over time as you don't have a Bone Singer to actually use it correctly and form it the way that you need to. And then there's also the problem of making new things out of Wraithbone. You can cut a chunk of Wraithbone away, and yeah, it's a dense, osseous material that is quite durable and heavily resilient, but beyond shaping it into a shiv or using it as applique armor, it's not of all that much value to you in comparison to what an Eldar Bonesinger could do with it, or even a normal Eldar Psyker of some kind could do with something like that. So, while Wraithbone has a lot of, initial wow factor as far as using it for things, in a very crude way, it can die, it can theoretically become less tough over time, more brittle, but the biggest problem is just making use of weapons and equipment that you can't really rearm, reload, fix, and energize because the technology and the material itself is actually kind of working against you in that way. However, of course, as mentioned, the value of the soul of the Eldar is another very important thing. Sacrificing Eldar soul stones is a known way to get the attention of Slaanesh, and thus to Slaaneshi or Chaos Undivided cults. Eldar soul stones, and matter of fact, Eldar bodies and the soul stones alongside them, are of great value to those cults. They act as many times their value equivalent if they were human souls. So, if you want to summon a greater demon, get the attention of the Prince of Pleasure, or, elevate yourself to demon princehood, entirely reasonable to go hunting the Eldar for those precious resources that they hoard so greedily. Getting your hands on lots of them, well, that's a little bit more difficult, but at least you know that once you do, you have a very potent ritual item in your hands. So, as a result of all these difficulties, their potential is the lowest form of interaction with chaos. You need direct action only. You will not find any ready volunteers amongst the Eldar to join your cult. Your direct action options are either to kill them and utilize their soul stone as a sacrificial item, or to use direct corruption on a captured Eldar to attempt to forcibly convert them to chaos, turning them into a spawn, a monstrous creature, or simply making them go insane. There are also examples where you can possess an Eldar and use their body puppeted around by a demon or by severe corruption in some cases, kind of the semi-possession that we'll go into in later videos. Moving on to a little bit more of an interesting one, the Dark Eldar. Now, the Dark Eldar are very different from their cousins. Now, for conversion, you can actually convert the Dark Eldar. Here's the mentality. You go from one protection method to another one. Essentially, the Dark Eldar, for protection, they kill and maim and feed off the suffering of other creatures in order to top off their souls to protect them from being completely devoured and hollowed out by Slaanesh. So, we have a problem for the Eldar that is natural to their race. The way that they solve it is by forcing others to suffer. And that can solve the problem. Yes. However, it's difficult to say if they've ever really explored other options. They have very similar taboos against chaos. However, it is usually focused quite heavily on being against Slaanesh. They have a negative relationship with Slaanesh because they must use what is essentially Slaaneshi methods, torture, masochism, and debauchery, to fill up their souls with the souls or the essence of other creatures that they are torturing in order to keep themselves alive. This means that they have a natural taboo against chaos worship of Slaanesh. However, not all gods are Slaanesh. There are 3 other gods to pick from, and the theory goes that if you were to get a Dark Eldar involved with a chaos cult, theoretically you could use a mix of ritualism and artifacts to inure or to protect their soul from chaos. Now, they still might suffer from the same thirsting, wasting of their soul that would require them to top it off every now and then. But if you could overcome that initial taboo, that initial issue with not really liking chaos because of the whole Slaanesh thing, for example, if you were to bring them into a cult of Khorne, and that cult of Khorne not only offered them protection from Slaanesh via chaos corruption of Khorne, but also giving them ritualistic protection or direct protection with a collar of Khorne, this could quite easily be a way to not only corrupt a Dark Eldar into the worship of chaos, but to willingly convert them. Now, here's the mental idea. You, as a cult, come across a group of Dark Eldar raiders. You vastly outnumber them, you capture them, you gain an understanding of what their plight is, because most people don't understand how the Dark Eldar work, and most cultists wouldn't know off the top of their head that, hey, their souls are getting devoured by Slaanesh. If you can convince one of the Dark Eldar to tell you what is happening and explain it to you, well, you could very easily put 2 and 2 together and say, oh, you never thought about this? Just bring yourself into Khorne and he will protect you from Slaanesh. It's a very simple concept. They are opposite gods, and we already use rituals to protect ourselves from the influence of the warp. There are ways that chaos can stain your soul to literally make it unappetizing to Slaanesh. For example, there are many examples of chaos corruption that it says it blackens the soul, or it burns the soul, or it devours the soul. Given the fact that you are still alive as a chaos cultist with this blighted, blackened, infected, burnt soul, there's still an object there giving you permanence and existence in real space. Without it, you would likely drop dead unless you were some sort of null with an inverted soul where the whole is a good thing. The Dark Eldar might not be aware of this. I mean, they might be aware of it tangentially, but the taboo keeps them from doing it. Back to our scenario with the cult, one or another of the Dark Eldar might decide that rather than being devoured by Slaanesh in this prison cell, they may as well give these cultists a shot. Now, giving it a shot, they may not survive. It's a pretty complicated and difficult ritual to protect oneself from a Chaos God, and it does require, in some cases, some pretty high-level artifacts. Collars of Khorne would be my go-to. Collars of Khorne are a mark of ownership. It is a respect thing given by Khorne, but it is also a leash. It is a mark through which he indicates his champions, and basically cuts them off from other forms of influence. He is now the prime driver. Now, that is a negative thing. For sure, you are giving up some agency, but the idea is essentially the collar protects you from Slaanesh. And that is true of Chaos Worshippers. If you think of the Collar of Khorne, one of the primary things that it does is protect you from the sorcerous magic of the other gods. It protects you from other Chaos Psychers or Psychers in general. It removes or negates any psychic powers brought against you. What is the effect upon the Dark Eldar's soul if not a psychic curse? As a result, could not the Collar of Khorne bypass and prevent this type of soul-sucking that Slaanesh is doing? Now, it is elemental to the Dark Eldar, but it is also not inherent to their race. It is a curse placed upon them as a result of Slaanesh's birth, meaning that, just like any other curse of chaos, it can be undone, and in this case, by a rival Chaos God. Now, outside of the Collars of Khorne, let's look at the other gods, for example. There are the sorcerous powers of Tzeentch. For the Dark Eldar being not so psychically attuned, I would say that Tzeentch is probably not the best option. The real danger there is that it reawakens the psychic power of the Dark Eldar, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how controlled they can keep those powers. I think Nurgle is the runner-up to Khorne as the most likely to be able to keep a Dark Eldar from Slaanesh. This is mostly because the diseases of Nurgle are often represented, and often literally, are demons of the soul. Creatures, or in some cases literal microbacteria, that are demonic in origin. Nurgle's rot, for example, is literally a spiritual virus just as much as it is a literal one. Meaning that if all of a sudden the soul that is being drained from you is laced with Nurglite corruption, it's very likely to either be rejected or to be cut off entirely, saving you from having any more damage done to your mortal form. This will naturally corrupt the Dark Eldar and lean them to the service of whatever Chaos God effectively saved their immortal life. But these rituals of protection can be done. We have seen them done before, and of course the Collar of Khorne is a great example of how one god's specialized magic can protect you or prevent the corruption or the use of another god's magic against you. So, in that way, the Dark Eldar can absolutely be turned to chaos, and they can do so willingly. And of course the other part is that the Dark Eldar are evil, pretty much inherently. So no matter what Chaos God they turn to, they will fit right in with all of the other cultists. They don't have much outside of a natural taboo against Slaaneshi worship that is keeping them from being just as murderous and violent as the average human, or the average cultist. How then can they be helpful? Well, we have a whole bunch. Traders. There is, of course, a lot of value in getting to know your local raiders from the Dark Eldar. If you are a Chaos Cult, you can set up a burgeoning, valuable trade in information and goods with these Dark Eldar. I have mentioned before the buying and selling of flesh for firearms. cultists often have far more mouths that they can actually feed, and the Dark Eldar are always in the mood or interested in getting more slaves and sacrifices. Now, if you're on the same side, you could have chaotic Dark Eldar trying to get back into Kamara to tell everyone the good news that they have managed to inure themselves to the degradation of Slaanesh. Now, there is a natural question there, by the way. If it is possible, why hasn't it been done yet? The real answer is there's quite a few steps that have to fall into place for this to be done. And of course, you would need to find a Dark Eldar and a Chaos Cult in the same exact place who were actually willing to try this out. So, while it is difficult and requires a little bit of effort, it is by no means unreasonable nor impossible. It just hasn't been explored as much yet. And of course, if we know that the Eldar themselves can be corrupted by chaos, it is fairly obvious that their Dark Eldar cousins would be even more vulnerable to genuine chaos worship. But outside of trading, you also have genuine traitors, those Dark Eldar who live on the edges of society and who are no longer accepted within Kamara. They are going to spend a lot of their time just out and about in the galaxy. Now, these include individuals who have been completely exiled and are no longer welcome within society whatsoever. They may end up on a random Imperial world acting as some sort of deranged serial killer, murdering people for fun and trying to keep themselves alive. If a Chaos Cult detects something like this, they could easily grab one and then try the conversion process on them. You could also get traders who are, in some ways, more willing to help out the cult than help out their Cabal. There are always Dark Eldar who are on the outs with the Cabal, and who might decide, fuck it. Let's give these Mon-Kai a run for their money and try a hand at working with these humans for a while. Again, it's not likely. They certainly do see humans as more animals than not, and the animals' silly religion would probably not interest the Dark Eldar until they figured out that perhaps these creatures are not all worshipping the Dark Prince. That is one of the major taboos between the Dark Eldar and the Chaos Cultist, is that it is assumed that Chaos worshippers are worshippers of Chaos Undivided. Cutting down the chance that the Dark Eldar run into a friendly, quote-unquote, Chaos cult significantly, because, of course, Undivided cults and Slaaneshi cults would much rather sacrifice them then and there, rather than run the chance of trying to make them inured to Slaanesh's influence. But Khornate, Nurglite, and Zechian cults are perfectly willing. And then finally, terrors. There are a lot of Stitch monsters and creatures and even some Xenos species that are bartered by the Dark Eldar, not to mention acting as mercenaries on occasion to Chaos cults. Now, in this case, again, we're talking about you give them a lump sum of human beings, and they go destroy some Imperial outpost or fight a mutual enemy. This is perfectly reasonable, and sometimes comes with a sting in the tail, but otherwise is a perfectly acceptable way to use the Dark Eldar as a Chaos cult. Now, how about their material and equipment? Almost all of the material and equipment that the Dark Eldar use works perfectly well in human hands. Unlike the Wraithbone gear and equipment that the Eldar use, which can sometimes break down, again, ossify, become brittle, run out of ammunition that isn't really usable anymore, a lot of the stuff for the Dark Eldar is pretty self-sustaining and pretty analog as far as being understandable with just a little bit of training. So you can use the weapons without reservations, but I would say be wary if you're not producing them with help. If you're trying to reproduce Dark Eldar gear that isn't very basic, most of their melee weapons are reproducible. I mean, even if you go into like the poisons or the monomolecular blades, these are things that human beings have been able to produce. Granted, not nearly as elegant or beautiful as the Dark Eldar or specialized for their needs, but at least monomolecular blades are within possibility for humans to create. So a demi-clave or a clave is not outside of the reach of humanity. Of course, if you're a Chaos cult, you're going to switch out the Druchii Chaos runes for the normal Chaos runes, but, it's just a little bit of difference. The reason I say be afraid if you're not getting help is if there's not a Dark Eldar, a member of your cult who you have converted, helping you to directly do this, whether they're directly helping out with production or just giving you pointers on how to make their stuff correctly, You might be concerned if you're trying to buy it or barter it directly from the Dark Eldar. They tend to put a sting in the tail, or at least some form of nasty, back-sided, tricksy bits in with the equipment and armor, whether it's very little ammunition is in the actual weapons, or the stuff is booby-trapped, or it's poisoned, or the stims that they give you are tainted. Something of that nature, just because some of them are incredibly petty, and if they don't feel like they're getting the advantage of the deal, well, they just can't sleep at night. So, for all these reasons, the potential for chaos interaction with the Dark Eldar is the highest form. A Dark Eldar, of almost any kind, can become a full cultist with some effort, genuinely capable of worshipping any of the gods except in undivided and Slaaneshi cults. Now, again, the best case scenario is Khorne, because Khorne has a direct item, a direct line of enchanted items that are intended to protect you from the magic of other gods. Like, it is a direct, this cancels out that mentality that basically would save the Dark Eldar from Slaanesh outright. With the downside, of course, of then tethering you to the will of Khorne, which we've already gone over in our Khorne video. So, honestly, I think that having Dark Eldar turn up in Chaos cults, again, in small numbers, we're talking ones and twos here. Callers of Khorne are rare, rituals of protection are highly expensive and usually only worth it if the creature is willing to do it. And of course, getting the creature willing to do it is a little bit more difficult. Definitely requires a lot of effort and probably a lot of dead bodies, but even with that effort, they can become full cultists, and getting one of them on your side is really dangerous and deadly because these creatures are incredibly capable, and for a Chaos cult, they will rapidly become your most powerful soldier and asset, the same way that a Chaos Space Marine would be. The Orcs! Yes, so, the Orcs, it is pointless to try and disillusion the Orcs and tell them that Gork and Mork is actually aspects of Khorne. They don't really understand that concept, even if the cult understands it themselves. There are examples of Khornate Orcs, aka Orcs infested with Khornate corruption. Ones who serve Khorne directly, such as, the Warp Killer, the dude who's on a demon prince's world and is constantly beating him to death. Those guys have obviously become far more corrupted over time. They've taken on the aspect of demons, and they keep getting resurrected by Khorne to fight over and over again. Those I would consider about the closest thing to orcish chaos cultists that we have. However, it is pretty pointless for you as a chaos cult to try and convince orcs that Gork and Mork are actually Khorne. You can try, and you can also pretend that you're worshipping Gork and Mork, and in reality you're worshipping Khorne. Perhaps, again, that one-way mirror effect of they worship something that is basically Khorne, you are worshipping Khorne alongside them, the worship will basically go to Khorne anyway. And then the other half of that, of course, is that sacrificing the orcs is of very little value whatsoever. Their souls, what is passes for a soul in the orc, the gestalt consciousness that they project, is of very little worth to the gods. It seems to be something that doesn't really feed them all that much. However, it could theoretically be of value just to use the Gestalt as warp energy. Because regardless of how you look at it as from a god's perspective, regardless of whether or not you think of Gork and Mork as Khorne, or whether or not you think of them as opposite gods, the souls of the orcs, the Gestalt, the number effect that they have, is still warp energy. So, while it is pointless to sacrifice individual orcs, it may be useful to torture and effectively to subdue a large number of orc souls and use it to attempt to power something. Again, this would be hyper-specific, and keeping orcs in captivity is dangerous, but keeping them allied is not impossible. How then can they be helpful with these many contradictions and difficulties? Well, the big obvious one is distractions. If you follow around an Orc Wa as a chaos force, you'll be able to pick up a lot in their wake. Orc Was rarely give much of a shit about infrastructure, about picking up Imperial firearms, about taking fuel or food, or even bothering with the non-fighting population. On occasion, they will massacre a whole bunch of people, and at that point, if you're a Chaos Cult, well, free converts, not to mention free weaponry, equipment, and gear. It would not surprise me if a Chaos Force, upon hearing that the Imperials were having difficulty with an Orcish Wa, turns right around and follows the Wa, because following the Wa is a very effective way of getting yourself a whole bunch of Imperial goods for basically zero effort. And of course, it draws the attention of Imperial governance. That's also related to weakness, of course. They weaken and soften up Imperial targets and make you much more capable of going in there. The other one is a little bit more complicated. Joint operations with the Orcs. The Orcs do not care about flags, they do not really care about allegiances, and while they do enjoy dem spiky boys as much as they enjoy dem Imperial gits, you could theoretically, if you were a small enough warband, sneak in alongside the Orcs and get into a scrap right next to them. Now, naturally, if you're on a battlefield with the Orcs and you ain't green the same way that they is green, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty not catching some flack whatsoever. But a little bit of flack might be worth it in order to achieve a strategic objective that the Orcs don't really care about. So, for example, a Chaos Cult has a prisoner on an Imperial world. They attract a warband of Orcs to that world. The Orcs attack the planet, and they cause a bunch of chaos and ruckus. The Chaos Forces then wait for the ruckus to get to its absolute peak, and launch a rescue attempt for their important person on that world, maybe the demagogue or something else of that nature. As a result, the Orcs have effectively performed a joint operation with the cult, working together. How then can their equipment or material be used? Well, you can use their equipment while they are there. Obviously, the Gestalt keeps their gear working at least as long as they are around in large numbers, but beyond that, most of their weapons and equipment simply do not work in human hands, so you're a little bit shit out of luck in that situation. However, there is one exception to this, and I've talked about it before in this slide, but taking a captive population of Orcs is very difficult. I mean, maintaining them is very, very hard. They need to constantly be fighting. They need to be constantly upcharging and trying to get in charge of whatever group or war boss they're doing. Your demagogue better be one hell of a monster, because he's going to have to be fighting the Orc war boss or the Orc chief, putting him back into his place every couple of days, honestly. It will consume a large amount of resources and equipment, but through using the Orcs' Wa energy, and sometimes through using their actual capabilities as quote-unquote pseudo-mercenaries, more like attack dogs, you can keep some Orcish technology running. One example might be that you keep a small horde of 100 to 150 Orcs in the enginarium of your ship. They do nothing except power the engines. Now, there's a couple of reasons to do this. I mean, obviously, if the Orcs believe that the engines have fuel and are powered, well, there's enough of them to make sure that the engines are fueled and have powered. The other side is, well, you have to keep culling the bastards and cutting them down before hundreds and hundreds of them just keep multiplying on your ship. So it is a constant maintenance headache and a bit of a pain to actually do, but it is doable to try and keep a small captive population of Orcs in order to keep one or another pieces of equipment functioning oh so orcally aboard your Chaos vessel, or even within your Chaos society on occasion. For this reason, they are a medium potential, definitely the medium form. They can only really be helpful through acts, and while they can't really understand Chaos worship, they can still worship and have their value transferred to the Chaos Gods in a way, through not only killing a bunch of creatures and having their souls be acting as fuel for a chaotic ritual, but also by indirectly or joint operationally assisting Chaos forces. Not to mention the more complicated process of keeping a captive population of Orcs within your Chaos cult. So, Tyranids and Gene Stealers, well, ain't this just a pickle? Well, Conversion-wise, hive mind meets organized religion. The hive mind for the gene stealers already is a religion, so converting them that way is difficult to impossible. Converting Tyranids with words is actually impossible. There is basically zero example of Tyranids ever giving a shit about any level of diplomacy outside of the very old lore where the Zotes were their heralds and diplomats. But even in that case, the diplomacy was rather stilted because the exchanges and value that the Tyranids were willing to offer was a lot less lenient than most factions. So, this is not a faction that you can effectively convince to join Chaos. You need to either trick them into it or you need to force them into it. Similar to the Eldar, but a lot more difficult because these guys have an effective either hive mind in terms of the Gene Stealers or a hive mind in terms of the Tyranids. So they are either all connected to each other through the synapse, or they are connected to a single individual creature through the Gene Stealer Patriarch. Now, what you could theoretically do is, if you corrupted the Patriarch, which you can do forcibly by forcing a demonic creature into him, again, he has the ability to resist that, he has psychic powers, he has a discount version of the Shadow and the Warp, so it might be difficult, it might be a little bit dangerous, it's definitely going to require much more energy to summon a demon into that creature than normal. But it is theoretically possible. The other option, of course, is to absolutely torture the Patriarch into non-responsiveness, making him unable to use his psychic powers, and then possessing him. At which point he may lose control of the cult entirely, and in that case, you can still theoretically use him as a puppet to recruit the Gene Stealers in that way. That's a much longer, more complicated process, and is probably not feasible for a majority of cults, because it means that you capture the Patriarch, basically, and you don't have to deal with the rest of the cult, which is very, very unlikely. How then can they be helpful with all these problems? Distractions is the biggest one. If there are Gene Stealers on a world, like we just went over with the recent Lugnum Adversaries campaign, they take priority over Chaos Cults. A vast, vast majority of the time, Gene Stealer uprisings are faster, they are more organized, they are far stealthier, they are often more terrifying to the administration of a planet because it means that you'll be fighting against your own people, not in the same way that you're fighting against Chaos Cultists. Chaos Cultists are considered, outside arch enemies. Because, of course, the Imperium denies the existence of Chaos, or local madmen. With the Gene Stealers and the Tyranids, it's a much more direct threat. So if you are a Chaos cult, and you know that there is a Gene Stealer uprising, well, it's time to get a lot more uppity and a lot more direct in your actions, because the planetary government is distracted at the moment, and you can probably make the best of this opportunity. The second one is the massive opportunity that Tyranids provide. Tyranids cause two things. One, panic and the mother of all distractions. There is nothing more important than a Tyranid invasion for a planet. And the second part of that is, well, with the Tyranids, everybody tries to leave and evacuate. As a Chaos cult, this is fertile ground to get out of Dodge and to steal a couple of ships while you are at it. Now, this massive opportunity is a little bit tempered by the fact that the Shadow and the Warp will drastically restrict your access to the Warp itself. I mean, it doesn't cut it off entirely, but it makes Psychers a lot more freaked out. Again, can a Chaos Psyker really be said to be more freaked out than, exploding every other 5 seconds? But you get my point. It can restrict you in some ways, but it also gives you the mother of all opportunities. It massively destroys a planet's cohesion and organization. It causes mass exoduses, and it causes massive distrust of the planetary government, which are all fertile ground for a Chaos cult to grab some ships, grab a ton of people, and make it off into the stars and escape with their worship bolstered by the planet's demise, or theoretical demise. How then can their equipment be used? Well, death is always useful to Chaos cults. Indirect death, as per a conflict that the cult is not engaging in, is not as powerful of a fuel as direct sacrifice, but it is still fuel. and to a degree, the massive amount of people dying can slightly outweigh or overcorrect for the Shadow in the Warp. Now, there are examples of Tyranid Shadows in the Warp that are particularly strong, designed specifically to counter chaos and the effects of the Warp. In that case scenario, you are kind of screwed, but outside of that, the Shadow in the Warp is not a perfect barrier, and, it is often able to prevent things like astropathic messaging, but psychic powers can still be used to a certain degree. All that a Chaos Cult needs is for their rituals to succeed. And since rituals are neither astropathic messages nor direct psychic powers, but rather functional ways that reality and the warp interact and intercede with one another, there's no necessary need for psychic potential or the ability for a psyker to work. It is rather the physical realm acting upon the immaterial and the reciprocal effect upon the material from the immaterial. So dropping a rock into a pond rather than sticking an electrical hose in, or an electrical wire into it, you can consider the difference between psychic powers and ritualism for chaos. So still fueling it with all that death, still pulling up massive amounts of pseudo-sacrifices from people dying in the distance to a Tyranid invasion will work just fine for a Chaos Cult. A little bit more difficult, the value might be decreased, but otherwise just fine. As a result of all of this, the potential for Gene Stealers and Tyranids is the lowest form. You can only benefit from their acts, and that only partially, and it's very difficult to actually direct their actions, so in that way they are the lowest form of interaction with chaos. What about the Tau? Now, this is one that I've talked about quite a bit. The Tau, two things for these guys. The first one is breaking the mind lock. Now, for the other species of the Tau, for the minor Xenos species, this is similar, but for the Tau themselves, the good old blue boys, you do need to break them out of the semi- or pseudo-psychic connection that the ethereals have with them. This is effectively mind control, and Chaos is very familiar with the concept of mind control. The idea of forcing someone else to obey your orders, requests, to view you as a god or a leader, it's something that's very common within chaos cults and warbands in general, which means that it's entirely reasonable for them to try and break it. Now, the difficulty here is that the souls of the Tau are rather weak, so what is this psychic effect acting upon in the case of the mind control? Well, the mind control, mind lock for lack of a better term, is part indoctrination, part pseudo-psychic pheromonal control, depending on how you want to interpret it with the ethereals. The reason that this is so difficult to break is because it continues to act upon the Tau even when they have been separate from the ethereals for some time. However, it can also be renewed by the ethereals returning. This is when we go into the whole pheromone theory, where it might be a biochemical combined with an indoctrination or psychic ability, or possibly even a combination of all three. The best way to break the mind lock is to introduce chaos corruption. Chaos corruption, and especially with the weak souls of the Tau, can still corrupt. It can still blacken the soul, and this could likely break one of the three links, biochemical, indoctrinational, and psychic, that the ethereals have on the Tau. Breaking that psychic link, changing the tenor of the soul of the creature, literally corrupting it to the point where it no longer interfaces correctly with the ethereal's influence, well, that's break number one, and this is one of the reasons why the Tau haven't been broken yet. Nobody's actually done all three. Number one, break the psychic connection. You could do this through corruption. You could also do this through the same way that you would with the Dark Eldar, which is protection rituals, defensive rituals, pseudo-possession, all that type of stuff. Mutation might also be another way to heavily change the physical form and thus the reflective soul of the creature, even if it is weak. The second one, the indoctrinational one, is a lot more complicated, and it takes time. It really depends what god you worship and how you worship them as to how to convince a Tau Fire Warrior, for example, to turn away from the ethereals. We know that it can be done. We know that there are, for example, the Farsight Enclaves who have turned against the Tau, the collective, the greater good, in spirit, but they have not fully turned to chaos, they have simply gone independent. Now, this is indicative of two of the bonds breaking. They have broken out of the indoctrinational bonds, they've broken out of the idea that the ethereals are the ones who represent the greater good, which proves that that can be done. And then two, it proves that they have gone away from the biochemical or the pheromonal connection with the ethereals. Essentially because they have separated themselves physically from the ethereals' influence, two of the tethers on their mind lock have been broken. That only leaves the psychic connection, keeping them away from the influence of chaos. Again, that does technically mean if you took a Farsight Enclave Tau, brain broke them a little bit to the chaos ideology, and then corrupted their soul, you could effectively create a genuine Chaos Cultist Tau. Now, is that a lot of effort to go through? Yes. Is it less effort than the Dark Eldar? Also yes. However, you're getting a lot less useful of a cultist in this case. Or, that's kind of arguable. We'll see about it with this. How can they be helpful then? And by the way, the weak souls thing, this is no justification to say that they can't be influenced by chaos. I have no idea why people use this argument. A weak soul or a corrupted soul is not an indicator of whether or not you can be afflicted by chaos. Chaos can afflict animals and plants. I think that a weak soul is not going to stop them. I really don't understand this argument. I hear it all the time. Well, they have weak souls. Chaos has no value for them. They have weak souls. Chaos can't corrupt them. Or the warp has no effect on them. This makes no sense if you really think about it from a logical perspective. Chaos corruption can affect basically everything, from the air you breathe to the reality around you to plants and animals if there's enough time and corruption. A living, sentient creature capable of understanding arguments and following a certain set of doctrines, no matter how weak the soul is, can still be corrupted. If it can apply to nulls and psychers, who have the opposite of soul and a lot of soul, respectively, a weak soul does not seem like the catch-all way to avoid corruption. It seems like a much easier way to get corrupted and yet resist some of the negative effects of corruption. So, for example, you could corrupt a Tau traditionally. Break all three mental connections. You capture a Tau, you corrupt their soul with chaos corruption via ritualism, direct influence of magic, demons, keeping them in the warp for a long period of time, exposed to the warp, whatever it may be. You break the biochemical pheromone connection that they have with the ethereals, spray them down with a fire hose, keep them away from the ethereals for a while, that one's broken. The hardest one at that point is then the indoctrination. As a Chaos cult, you have a lot of ways to indoctrinate people. For a prisoner on a Chaos vessel, all you really have to do is break their mind a little. That includes a lot of torture methods, but, those can all still work. And if you break all three of those, there's a fairly solid chance you're going to break them out of the mind lock, and then you can turn them into a full, true blue, pun intended, cultist. What about the other ways? Well, the first one goes back into that weak soul thing. On one hand, people see it as a negative. I actually see it as a massive positive. If you are soulless or less likely to be noticed because your soul is less important in the warp, it doesn't shine as much, you are stealthy. You can't really be seen or identified as easily by demons. By the way, one of the reasons that the Farsight Enclaves, that Commander Farsight is able to summon demons effectively with his demonic sword, and then they don't really fight him. They don't go for him, in my opinion. That's because he's already corrupted by Khorne, and we're just waiting on that indoctrination thing to break down before we take him and make Farsight the Demon Prince a canon thing. But, that's a theory for another time. I think he's going to be numero uno for the new Chaos Princehood of the Tau. But this stealth effect, the fact that some people will simply overlook the Tau, and I include demons in that people term, that could be pretty stealthy, and it can be pretty dangerous if there's a psyker seeking out living beings and trying to find something. Well, you could keep a Tau around with a corrupted soul, and by golly, he might be hard to spot for a psyker or someone using demonic powers. that's a really effective way to create a nasty stealth trooper. And TBH, I actually think it would be pretty funny to have a Zechian cult of the Alpha Legion that used the Tau as stealth troops, literally like anti-psyker stealth troops, because they're difficult to sense due to their weak souls, they're corruptible using enough indoctrination, which the Alpha Legion are very good at, and they are technologically capable, which the Alpha Legion love. And then the last one, this is kind of a really theoretical one. Because they have weak souls, because the soul is often responsible for that interaction between the physical and the non-physical realms, it is technically possible or feasible or arguable that the soul's corruption is what leads to mutation. So if you have less or a less powerful soul to corrupt, that could imply that you will suffer less mutation. You could be mutation resistant. And in that way, that makes the Tau pretty useful as soldiers. Mutations are not always beneficial. Massive mutations that change the creature or resistance to spawnification, these could all be helpful for a Tau warrior to inhabit. They don't have to worry about corruption as much. They can drink in as much warp energy as they need to because, well, they're not going to grow 12 arms. They're not going to become a spawn. Their soul can only get so saturated before it kind of just taps out. And maybe it causes physical damage to them over time. It might drive them insane, of course, but in small doses or over a long period of time, there's a high chance that they might maintain a lot of their physical form by being mutation resistant for this reason. What about their equipment? Well, you can directly use most Tau equipment, almost all of it, and this in fact applies to a lot of their allied species as well, not just the Tau themselves, but others. Some of the others, in fact, are far easier to corrupt to Chaos, which is why I don't even imply or talk about them. You could corrupt many, many other of the Tau allied forces to Chaos with basically cutting out a couple of the steps that I already went over with converting the Tau, and then just go through that process, and you will make not necessarily a full cultist, but you will at least make an ally of one sort or another. However, the big issue with the Tau weaponry and equipment is slow production. The Tau weapons are high-tech, and they require a decent amount of technological know-how and capability that not every Tau knows because of their compartmentalized caste system. They don't all know how to make weapons and equipment, and it's not really as straightforward as making a firearm. The Tau weaponry, while they might be able to be reloaded, because of course they use similar ammunition to Imperial plasma weapons, so they might be reloaded, but making a new weapon of the Tau design, that might be difficult or impossible, but at the very least, it's going to be slow. So you can't rely on it, but maybe if your Tau troopers are uncomfortable using human weapons, you might set up or barter with the Dark Mechanicum or something of that nature to get more Tau equipment or the materials to make more Tau equipment for them. Now, again, for these reasons, their potential for Chaos interaction is the highest form. Tau can become full-on Chaos cultists. It just hasn't happened yet because, well, there are difficulties involved. Difficulties that often provide you with a cultist that most cults would consider not of equal value to just converting a normal human. So while it is possible, it is very difficult, and having a Tau self-convert, like we are nearly having with Farsight in future, hopefully, crossing my fingers, Farsight, but having that happen is even less likely because, of course, the Ethereals have a very heavy chain on their neck. But again, we're talking about potential here, and they have the highest form of potential. They can be full cultists all the way through to the point of genuine worship. The Necrons. Well, ain't this one a bit of a bitch? Well, conversion-wise, we have three different classes of Necrons. We have the Mindful, the Necrons who are still capable of thinking, have their personalities, and are relatively able to reason and consider. Can you convert one of these Necrons to Chaos? No. They are smart enough and they remember enough to know that Chaos is their lifelong, enemy, and anything to do with the warp or even living humans is not a good idea. So the taboo that was a minor or a medium problem with the Dark Eldar and the Eldar respectively is turned up to 11 here. You're not going to be able to get the Mindful to actually willingly convert. That would be very difficult, if not impossible. The Mindless. What about the normal Necron warrior? Can you convince a walking metal skeleton to join your cult? No. No, you cannot. You can try. You can certainly try. And theoretically, you can not necessarily hotwire, but hijack certain constructs to make them work for you. For example, scarabs can technically be kidnapped and used for certain applications, but this is highly suspect, and theoretically, they could just dematerialize and go back to where they came from if they were ever noticed missing. So stealing a whole bunch of them would probably be a little bit difficult, but a couple of them, maybe using them as like welders or something, would be theoretically possible. But even the mindless are still not really convertible whatsoever. What about the mad? This is the last question, and it's kind of a good one. There are Flayer lords in the Necron empires. There are Flayer empires. There are insane Necrons who know nothing but destruction and killing. They could be turned to chaos, but not as worshippers. They could only be turned into living, directionless weapons. How you would effectively have to do this is you would have to massively isolate the Necron, something that is already very difficult because once they are destroyed, they will, reanimation and reclamation protocol, disappear, melt into living metal, and then go back and get engrammatically restored into a new body. So you have to keep them semi-alive and within an area, but you need to keep them away from things like Blackstone. Then you would need to physically and psychically implant into them some sort of heavy dose chaos corruption. Problem, they are living metal. They are soulless. The energy that they feed off does not directly translate into something that a demon can feed off. So, you would then need to attach a fuel source, a psychic fuel source, to the creature that you have created, and you would effectively then be puppeting the monster rather than actually controlling it. So a demonic harness or carrier or something of that nature is implanted into the creature, be it a Necron warrior or a Necron destroyer, and you then empower it in some way and use it as effectively a Pinocchio, a puppet. Now, is that actually worth it? No, not really. It's definitely not worth it in my opinion, and I think it would be way, way, way too much effort for something that is only tangentially useful for a limited period of time, because of course eventually it will either destroy itself or it will run out of power and get reclaimed or try and kill you. So, not of all that much use in terms of conversion. How can they be helpful? Well, I have a lot of ways in which they can't be helpful, but let's start with some ways that they can be helpful. Blackstone. Blackstone is useful. Blackstone constructs, Blackstone items, Blackstone material, enchanted stuff that can be used, or not enchanted, but engrammatic Blackstone, things that can interfere with warp energies. Now, some of these work like null rods, some of them work like tech, some of them work like just building blocks, and they don't do anything whatsoever. But the general idea with Blackstone is that it is a material that is a psychic dampener. Now, the question might be, if you're a Chaos Force, why do you want a psychic dampener? You like psychic. Not all the time. You sometimes need to protect yourself from psychic things, and as a result of that, Blackstone can sometimes be protective as literally like a lead-shielded plate against chaos corruption. Now, does it have negative effects, and can it cause damage to you over time? And of course, can it more importantly and more patently interfere with your worship of chaos to have a literal block of lead between you and the oh-so-tasty corruption? Yeah, it can, but there's also times where you need to protect yourself from corruption because the alternative option is becoming a chaos spawn. So it can be used almost like a control rod for rituals in that way. A little bit more complicated than using something like a null or null dust or a null rod or like saint relics or things like that, but it can still be used. The next one is ancient knowledge. Chaos cults often benefit from knowing things, and the Necrons know a lot of things. However, you do need to come across one of the mindful, and as we talked about, they are not really good converts, and they are often very, very unfriendly to Chaos forces, both because they are living and because they are Chaos. However, there are two positives. Relatively speaking, Necrons are predictable. They are slow, they kill living things, they do not care about much else. Awakening dynasties, personal feuds, all of this is far too esoteric for a Chaos cult to understand. However, with them being relatively predictable and not likely to fly off the handle and do something insane like the Orcs might or even like the Dark Eldar might, Well, you can track the Necrons and follow them in the same way that you could the Orcs. Now, it's a little bit more complicated because of the Dolmen Gates, but it does mean that if there is a planet that has a known Necron presence, it is likely to attract more Necrons, and as a Chaos Cult, that is a weakened resistance, and oh boy golly, do we love weakened resistances. And that means that if the Necrons go and murder everyone, there's a whole bunch of valuable grave goodies left behind when the Necrons leave. Or, alternative option, while the Necrons are killing everyone in one place, you drop down in another place, offer the humans escape if they bring all their valuables and leave right now. An effective way for a cult to increase its numbers by effectively preying like vultures upon the death of another civilization. It's lovely, and it works just fine, as long as you happen to come across the Necrons doing they thang. How can their material be used? Well, Blackstone times 2. Again, I gotta mention it here. Blackstone can be of use. There are constructs made of Blackstone. There are specific technologies made of Blackstone. These things can still technically be used by Chaos Cults, and they can be of value that way. However, they are of so much and so many different varieties that I'm not really going to go too deep into it, because it tends to be literally unique to the situation as to what the technology actually does, and whether or not you need living metal in order to do it. The other one is, can you steal Necron weapons the same way that the Imperials steal Necron weapons? For example, the Catan Phase Blades. Those are stolen Necron tech. Could a Chaos Cult technically steal that stuff? I would say yes. So, it is perfectly reasonable then to try and poach some equipment from downed Necrons, specifically the ones with swords or other similar equipment of that kind. Will it provide you with a lot of small arms or uncomplicated weapons? No. Does it require a little bit of reverse technology? Yes. Is it of some value to the Dark Mechanicum as a trade medium? Also yes. So for all of these very limiting reasons, the potential for interaction with Chaos for the Necrons is the lowest form. Essentially, only the items and tangential actions of the Necrons will be of value to the Chaos Cult. Now, let's get into the fun one. Minor Xenos species. This is not by any means an exhaustive list. We're just going to go over several different instances right quick. We have the minor Xenos that are already friends with Chaos. All of these guys are high interaction, very good friends to have, good allies. We already get along with them. We have the Luxatl, who need Chaos to breed. They are known mercenaries. They are known allies to Chaos. They are friends to Chaos. They enjoy Chaos corruption. It helps them increase their numbers. And they work for food, breeding grounds, and territory, all of which a Chaos Cult can provide to them. The Grell. The Grell are theoretically of equal or theoretically friendly with human cults. They were part of a pseudo-human chaotic empire that was also combined with Xenos, essentially a chaos-worshipping Xenos species that lived side by side with humans for a number of years, and is at least on good terms with other chaotic forces. The Grell are of value. They have psychic capabilities and weaponry of their own, though they are very limited in number. You have the Strixus, who are great friends with Chaos. I truly do believe that the Strixus, while not likely to be corrupted and directly allied with a Chaos Cult, would absolutely get along with Chaos Pirates, Spacebound cults, Warband cults, and they would act effectively as a general store. The Strixus have lots of different items and equipment for sale from other Xenos, from the Imperium at large, from the Dark Age of technology, from things that they've scrapped and scavenged, and as a result, these massive Sebecs, the multi-connected ships that the Strixus inhabit, act as a super Walmart, a mega mall for a Chaos force to calmly and stoically deal and bribe and pay their way into a lot of extra equipment that the Strixus can provide. And the Strixus don't care about Chaos whatsoever. They are willing to deal with Chaos, and they don't give a darn about corruption for the most part, so you could be the worst of the worst and still get a deal from the Strixus. Now, the Lair and the Zotes. These are a little bit unclear. The Lair because they are hella old, and it's not exactly clear how their connection with Chaos would be in the modern day, if they are still around, and then the Zotes. So, the Zotes, you might know them as the diplomats or the ex-diplomats of the Tyranid hive mind. It is unclear because, well, they've kind of been written out of the lore. They are still extant, they are still around, but we have no idea whether they're related to the Tyranids anymore, and for the most part, they've kind of fallen out of the lore. Now, one of the things that was noted about the Zotes is that they are highly intelligent and psychically active, but the Tyranid hive mind literally purges and or restricts their psychic access and dumbs them down and controls them like a puppet in order to prevent them from rebelling. Now, a creature that can rebel against the Tyranid hive mind and has gone missing largely from the hive mind and is also psychically active, well, that sounds like a friend in waiting. We have mutual enemies. You don't like the Imperials, you don't like the Tyranids. You're psychically active, and you are a highly intelligent Xenos species. That sounds like buddy-buddy situation to me, and in many cases these would be highly isolated reptilian creatures using a mix of Tyranid biotech and their own psychic capabilities in addition to Imperial technology, which they have been shown to be able to use given that they are able to use bolt guns and power fists in combat. So a great ally there, potentially, if you can find some. Now, the next level is can be friends, aka we have mutual enemies, but you don't necessarily like us specifically. The Uvath and the Xenarch are in similar situations here, and they are similar. They see humans as lesser and are often very isolationist or isolated. Now, the Uvath and the Xenarch, they both worship chaos. They're both genuine chaos worshippers. They're both followers of the Dark Gods in their own various ways. They use warp tech. They would seem as natural allies. Problem: both of them see humans as basically either fuel for their rituals or scum and don't want to interact with them. That is with Imperials, however, we don't really see their interaction with Chaos cults all that much. Some Xenos species automatically assume that all humans are below them. However, not all of them have actually met genuine Chaos worshippers. So, we'll call the Uvath and the Xenarch possibly friends, theoretical friends, because we have mutual enemies and we have mutual worship. Now, what about the Bargasi? Well, the Bargasi, I think, they're a pretty solid ally to a Chaos cult. They are intelligent, technological, and incredibly capable Xenos who, while terrifying, are very much enemies of the Imperium, and, judging by the Dark Eldar, are capable of being captured and at least convinced to fight in a certain way. Now, the Bargasi for the Dark Eldar are literally just let loose into the Kamara fighting pits to be warriors, but that's not too far off from what a Chaos cult would want of the Bargasi, so they are just angry enough to be of value to a cult and theoretically even be friends. What about the Hrud? Well, the Hrud use warp tech, and their warp tech, while seemingly natural and related to their migratory pattern through real space, doesn't really preclude them from any level of higher technological or higher theological ideals. The Hrud can, again, be theoretical friends to Chaos. If they were approached in the correct way, not to upset them, and certainly not in the way that the Imperials do, which is often to just try and genocide them outright, they could theoretically be of value. Now, is it safe to do this? The Hrud are some of the most dangerous enemies to any human, so I would say not safe. You definitely would want to bring some gas masks to keep away the Sasak gas, but other than that, I would say that they are a theoretical friend. Again, this is a bit of a stretch, but given the fact that they have a direct connection to the warp, it's a little bit more difficult to justify in comparison to these next ones, which is harder to be friends, aka they need a lot of convincing and a lot of effort. Now, this collects a whole different bunch of minor Xenos races, but a best example is the Saruthi. The Saruthi and other similar species have things like interwarp tunnels, so they're very deep in the warp and they're separated from it, much like the Eldar webway was, or are hyper-isolationists, even more isolationist than the Xenarch or the Uvath, or they are completely destroyed as a race. There are simply no more of them, or there are so few that they are a drop in the bucket, a tiny, dwindling population that would either not be of use to the cult, or would be so minor and so small that they have fled to the farthest edge of the galaxy and can no longer be found. These guys just need a little effort in order to find and to convert them. They're not necessarily inherently chaos inclined, but for examples like the Saruthi, they clearly do understand the use and existence of the warp. They are not animals, they are intelligent, and thus as a result capable of understanding and internalizing chaos theology. So, those are the three for them. I hope that you guys enjoyed this one. Credit, of course, for this video to GW, Grant R. Brown, Nick DeNova, Dees, Demur Sanger or Snager, Taurus Chaos Lord, Elifuz, Vicente, Silvera Catal, Dimi Sokolov, and Necrocephalopod for their lovely artwork. I was glad to get this one out. A lot of people asked for it. There will likely be more videos coming out in the next few days, and then likely a vote after that. I have several different ideas percolating in the old brain case, and of course they are all getting worked on. With that said, I hope that you all guys leave a comment, give us a subscribe, and let me know what you think, and I wish you all a lovely good night.